We're back. This is our last session of the day. And because the question came up and because it took way too long to get the answer, I'll say so now while I have you in front of me. The bookstore down on the first floor, it's about a 40-minute walk if you leave now. It closes at 5 today. Is that what she said? And 6 tomorrow and Wednesday. That's the Digital Guru bookstore, where a lot of our speakers' books and other books are for sale for 20% off. So please check that out. And the mail workstations, the computers, are basically available until we're done at the end of the day. They lock the doors when the last one of us leaves. So there you have that piece of info as well. And now, finally, I get to introduce Doug Bowman, which I didn't get to do earlier today. He is the principal of Stop Design, a web and print. Print? You do print as well?
No print anymore.
No print anymore. All web design consultancy based here in the city. He's been involved with some very high-profile redesigns of late, including AdaptivePath.coms and Blogger.coms. Prior to founding Stop Design, he was affiliated with the Terra Lycos folks, correct? Mm-hmm. And for the last year or so, he says he's been working on secret projects that he'd have to kill us if he told us about. So we'll just have to take our word for it. He's going to talk to us about creating beautiful interfaces with CSS. Please say good afternoon to Doug Bowman.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you. Well, back on stage for the second time today. And this is the presentation that I really, really love because it's something that is not only close to my heart, but it deals with everything that I deal with on a daily basis, especially looking at the beautiful aspects of CSS. And we'll talk about what I mean by that in a second. But again, I want to kind of get a quick show of hands because I've been doing this for the last 3 years that I've been speaking. I just want to get an idea of what my audience is. How many of you have been dabbling in CSS for a year or more? Okay. Keep your hands up for a second. 2 years or more. 3 years or more. Okay. 5 years or more? Okay. A few of you still had your hands up. Notice my hand went down. That used to be a lot more meaningful when I'd only been doing it for like a year, and I was up on stage talking about this. But the point of that has always been not only for me to gauge what the level of familiarity is with you, with the audience, but also just to note that it doesn't take very long to get very comfortable with CSS. It doesn't take very long to really grasp the basics of CSS and just hit the ground running. I love the fact that it's written in common terms that designers understand. I'm a designer by nature. Obviously, developers can understand it just as easily, information architects. But I want to talk about the beauty of CSS. I want to talk about its beauty by design. And when we get into that, I want to just highlight the definition here, looking up the definition on Merriam-Webster. And I want to highlight the fact that it is widely recognized and regularly used. So as a standard, this benefits both those who create the tools, the browser makers, software developers, and also those of us who create with the tools. It's a very key, I think, defining factor about a standard is that it is benefiting those on both sides of the equation. It's guaranteeing some consistency as far as what the browser makers are targeting when they're building and implementing their software and their devices. And it's also giving us consistency, those of us who produce content, design content, develop content. It's giving us some consistency for what we end up targeting for. How many of you are watching this series right now? Anyone interested in Lost? If you're not, I warn you, if you start watching it, it's very addictive. But anyway, my fiance and I just recently started watching this maybe a couple of weeks ago. We rented the whole first season on DVD. And now we're trying to catch up to the current episode. So if you tell me anything about the last couple episodes, I'm going to kill you. So anyways, imagine if we were, by the time the Season 2 DVD comes out, which we're on Season 2 right now of Lost, by the time that comes out, we throw a big party, we invite a bunch of people over to our house, we pop in the DVD to our DVD player, and we get this kind of message back. Not compatible with your TV. And there were a couple of chuckles in the audience because I think you can draw the parallels pretty quickly with what we see on the web. We see this kind of all the time, and still to this date do we see messages like this, like best viewed in Internet Explorer, or best viewed at 1024 by 768, whatever. We see this kind of stuff all the time, and the current level of support for CSS and other web standards is at a level where we don't need to do this kind of stuff anymore. At all. Period. No excuse for it. Even if you're developing high-end, AJAX-rich application stuff, test your stuff in all the browsers first make sure at least you get some base level working. At least make sure it degrades to all browsers so that all people can use your site, your application, whatever. I was traveling around Australia last year, actually about a year and a half ago now, and to avoid the exorbitant costs of paying for Singular's international calling, I picked up a SIM card from Vodafone. To activate the card, you had to go online to their website, enter in some codes, your address, and give them, your life's data, and they would activate your card for you. So I pulled it up in my browser. I had this little Mac with me, and I get this message right away. Vodafone website is optimized for viewing in Internet Explorer version 5 or above. Okay, and I thought, well, I've got Mac IE 5. No problem, just boot that up. Pulled up Vodafone's site, and I get the exact same message. Wait a minute, I thought you told me I needed to use Internet Explorer version 5 or above. Obviously, some short-sightedness going on here, and obviously some very platform-specific development going on as well. But my point is that we're at a level now of support in different browsers where we don't need to do anything like this anymore. There are some certain JavaScript protocols and applications that everything might not function in certain browsers, but we certainly need to make sure it degrades. And we at least let people be able to view and see some of your content, some of your application somehow. So back to the beauty of CSS. I want to draw this parallel with nature that I love. I think there's an inherent beauty about nature that goes beyond just the surface level. It's not just about what you see on the surface. It's also about how things form and grow, or how things are structured from the inside out. And CSS allows us to structure our documents in a similar way. It allows us to create something that's beautiful both above the surface and beneath the surface. For 10 years now or so, we've been creating some pretty cool websites. If you look back in the last 5, 10 years, you're going to see some really attractive, really gorgeous websites out there that are some examples of some of the best design out there. But if you look under the hood, they're crap. They're a confusing mixture of tables and nested tables and font tags and spacer GIFs and everything just to get the content looking just so. But we no longer have to do that. We also get this advantage of CSS, and I'm not going to make a blanket statement here that it always is bundled with accessibility, but it often is. Because of, and I mentioned this in my last presentation, because of that CSS is associated with some best practices kind of come in a package, we tend to use more semantic markup. We tend to be very intent on what we mark our things up with. We try to make our markup lean. That leads to, by default, most of the time, more accessible websites as well. Now, just to tell a story really quick, that this accessibility thing was only theoretical to me when I started out redesigning Wired News in 2002. I didn't really know personally what accessibility meant. Like, I'd encountered a few blind people in my life, encountered people in wheelchairs. I never really understood exactly what accessibility meant, what access for all really meant, until after the Wired News redesign, we were getting a steady stream of feedback email. Most of the feedback email coming into the Wired News alias, which was about 200 to 300 messages a day, were people that were pissed off. Something that we had done, we changed something about the way that they viewed the site, we changed the design, the colors were too bright. There was a whole list of things that they would complain about on a regular basis. And then, through the graciousness of people like Eric Meyer and Jeffrey Zeldman, they linked to my business site, Stop Design, where I was blogging kind of about the decisions behind the Wired News redesign, the move to standards, the move to CSS. And so people who were finding my site, who were finding Stop Design, were people who were already interested in what we were doing in the first place. So any of the feedback messages that I started to get through my own site were mostly positive in nature. And they're mostly kind of followed along the lines of, Dear Mr. Bowman, I just saw the Wired News redesign through such and such site. I just want to let you know, like, great move. I think this is a great step forward for the web, and just wanted to thank you for doing this. And then they'd have some comments specific to them. And most of the emails followed along the same format, and they were kind of they would kind of help me, revive off or bounce back off the surface after being killed by all the Wired News feedback emails that would come in during the day. So I'd use those emails as kind of encouragement, like, okay, yeah, I think we did the right thing. But again, all this accessibility stuff, these benefits that we're getting in theory were just theoretical to me. I didn't really know exactly what these things that we'd done, what these techniques that we had done, what the markup changes that we'd done, how those were affecting users, until I got a message about 2 weeks after the redesign that, again, followed the same format. Dear Mr. Bowman, I found your site through Zeldman.com. I just want to let you know I'm really appreciative of what you've done. I think it's a great step forward for the web. and I just want to thank you for your effort, and best of luck to you. And then I got to the last line of his email, and it said, by the way, I'm blind. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. To get a message from someone who is now able to access this content that we put up on a regular basis, on a daily basis, someone who can go in and understand it and can browse it without problem now, can have it read to him, whatever this case may be. But that was just a huge life-changing moment for me. Suddenly, I didn't necessarily think of myself as just a visual designer who designs things that people like you and me can see up on this slide. I now design for all types of people. I'm not just designing things for visual people. I'm designing things for people who maybe can't even touch a computer keyboard, or maybe can't even see what's in front of them. But it fundamentally changed how I view what I do for a living. And that's when I really started to apply these ideas of, wow, so this standard stuff that we just kind of happen to jump into almost by accident is also getting all these great advantages of accessibility and speed and flexibility and maintenance. And some of the accessibility issues finally became real, even just by that one message that I got from that one blind guy. So anyways, I tell you that just to say that if these benefits to you seem sometimes theoretical, and you might not always have a real run-in when you get to see how much of an impact it can make on someone when you make a site accessible, or when you make a site leaner, or you take out all the extra stuff that we used to put in the presentational code and the markup. Even if you hear a story like that and you realize that you can affect how people view your sites, even if it's 1% of your market, less than 1% of your market, 1% of 1%, there are still great benefits that you can bring to individuals that by allowing them to access their content and being able to access it just like everyone else can. So I want to move on really quick to a quote that we can even find about CSS that kind of details the flip side of thinking how beautiful CSS is. It's an ugly, awkward tool that I'm forced to use with my opposite hand. Lots of limitations and quirks prevent it from working the same way everywhere. And you know who this quote came from? Yeah, it was actually me that said that. There are times when I hate CSS. I'll be honest. Can't figure out what's going on. I'm beating my head into the monitor. Can't figure out why Internet Explorer isn't doing the right thing. Can't figure out why Firefox is treating this differently than Safari. It boggles my mind sometimes, and know that you're not alone if you've ever run into situations that are challenging to you and you think, I just can't figure out what's going on. I tried everything here. There are times when it's not exactly the most ideal thing, but it is something that still has a lot of power and flexibility, and I still love working with it on a regular basis. So that's to say that CSS is not necessarily a magic bullet. It's not going to solve all of your problems. It is no substitute for a well-planned design process. It will not fix all of your usability issues on your site. It will not guarantee you accessibility. There's a lot of things that CSS won't do. A lot of people jump into it kind of assuming like, oh, we just get all these benefits by default. It is possible to create a completely inaccessible and a bulkier, heavier site if you use CSS for layout. It is possible to do that. It's not likely, but it is possible, and I've seen it done. And I've seen people use CSS for the complete wrong reasons. So where does it fit into the whole puzzle of what we do for a daily living? And I advocated this a little bit in the last presentation. I'll do it again here. CSS, from my perspective, is an implementation tool. It's not a creative tool. If you set out trying to create and design something with HTML and CSS, you'll be able to create something. You'll get something out there, and it might look reasonably okay, depending on what your skill set is. But by starting out with an implementation tool instead of a creative tool, such as pen and paper, or Photoshop, or Visio, or OmniGraffle, or anything that allows you to just create like you're drawing, like you're trying to plan out the design. If you begin a design with HTML and CSS, which is possible sometimes, you will end up becoming limited by your own knowledge of what the tool is. And if you have that limit, if you are already limited in what you know CSS can do, you're limiting your design to those same limitations. So I would actually advise starting out with some other kind of design tool, whatever it be, some kind of creative tool, and then moving to HTML and CSS to implement what you just designed. Because if you start out the other way around, it's possible to do that, but I think you're going to be limited by your own knowledge. Even for myself, I've tried it before. I realized, ooh, this isn't looking too great. I need to kind of go back and spend some time on design, get rid of the HTML and CSS for a little while, and then come back to it and actually implement it. Because you'll find that you'll be able to create much richer designs, much richer visual presentation, and then you'll have to go back into HTML and CSS and figure out, well, okay, I know what I want to do. Now I just have to figure out how to do it. And that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about today. But I just want to encourage you to think about going along those lines. And I'll actually talk about one product where we specifically went that approach and make sure that we started with design before we even worried about what we're going to do with the CSS. So, people who have led by example. And I just have a really quick little compendium of sites major sites that have launched in the last few years. High-profile sites, commercial, that have gone to all CSS layout. A lot of these are going to look very familiar. You at least know the brand names for all of them. You may not have known that all of them launched using CSS layout. So, hundreds of sites. And actually, literally, thousands of sites have launched in the last 3-4 years since Wired News launched in 2002. In fact, if we maybe zoom out one more level, we might be able to see one of the characters responsible for some of this. If you recognize that picture, that's actually Eric Meyer. He's the one responsible for any of my early knowledge about CSS. In fact, I think he's the expert that knows far more about it than I ever will. So I credit him with a lot of mine, especially my early learning. And again, I can never have a presentation about CSS without mentioning the Zen Garden. The Zen Garden, if you don't know what it is or if you haven't never been there, go there after this presentation. Go there tonight, tomorrow, whenever. Spend some time looking around. It is, I think, one of the single most important and easiest to see examples of what the power of CSS is. Jeff talked about it this morning in his keynote. I talked a little bit about it in my earlier presentation. It is by far the easiest demonstration of the power and flexibility of CSS. Close to 200 official designs. And it is, I warn you again, this is also a time killer as well, because you can just start browsing, and you can go next design, next design, next design. And you find one you really like, and you can view the source, and you can check it out and see exactly how it was built. You see some interesting technique. Zoom the text on some of these, resize your browser, see what's going on, scroll it around. Really interesting things going on in many of the different designs. So I mentioned this morning that I was also going to bring up some other gallery-based resources. Here's just a small sampling of those that are available. These are probably some of the biggest ones I know of. They're all available. And again, this presentation will be available online on my site. Actually, it is right now, but I'll give you the URL at the end. These are great resources to just go and start browsing around with thumbnails and just be able to see, like, you noticed the site that launched a couple months ago. You don't exactly remember what its name was, what the URL was. But you can just go here and kind of go back through the archives, like month by month, however long ago you think it was they launched. And most likely you'll be able to find it just by browsing through the thumbnails, and you can go and look at some of the comments that other people have said. So they're great resources also for finding more inspiration, for finding other techniques. So use any of those you deem necessary. So now I want to get into a few, this is kind of a mixture, a hodgepodge of techniques, of tips, anything that you can use to start creating better looking sites immediately. If any of you have read Stop Design or List Apart, you've probably heard of this technique that I wrote about a couple years ago called sliding doors. I like to start off with it because it demonstrates the simplicity of what I think are really good advanced techniques. Advanced techniques shouldn't be advanced because they're complicated. They should just be advanced because no one's done them before and it's just a new way of thinking about things. But in reality, the better techniques, the best techniques out there are the simplest ones to implement and the ones that work everywhere immediately. So, for those of you who don't know what sliding doors is, doors, plural, doors is. I can zoom in on this a little bit, just so you can see that in the back. Remember the tab-based interfaces that we would have to create in the old days with images when we'd create a separate image, say, for each tab, and possibly an extra set of those for the currently selected tab, maybe even a third set for the hover state. And you have to go in and maybe construct this with a table, or maybe you'd use text, but then you'd have to use this extra set of images for the kind of state in between each tab, kind of the connection where they kind of all fall down. And so if your manager ever came to you and wanted to change one of the names of one of the tabs, it's kind of a pain to go back into Photoshop or ImageReady or Dreamweaver or whatever you used, recreate that image, re-export it, upload it to a server, let the whoever engineer know that you need to re-update or resync, whatever. It's just a long, kind of convoluted process. And it was also made just with images, and so you've got extra load time for a lot of those that have to load on every page. But if we could do this with just pure text and use some background images that happen to slide apart or together based on how wide they need to be, it's much easier to do something that's completely flexible and that will completely stretch or expand or contract based on the amount of text we put in there or how large that text gets based on what the user sizes their text to in the browser. There are multiple versions, multiple demonstrations of this. There's a couple of articles on a list apart about sliding doors, but how does it work? How do they work? We start out by just creating some basic link text with a link anchor, an A tag, a element. Whatever padding we apply to that element creates this kind of visible doorway just for that link. Then we take two images. One is a really wide image. We'll make that the right image right now. And we take one very narrow image, a left side image. I made these a little bit bigger just so you can see what's going on. But the left side image only needs to be as wide as the change in shape is from the right side to the left side. We take that right side image and we anchor it to the right side of the visible doorway via a background image. So we apply that to the LI itself. And we take a left side image and we apply that to the left. We take another image, the narrow image, and apply that to the left side of the doorway. Then when the text expands, or you insert more text, or longer text, or shorter text, that visible doorway automatically expands. Those images move apart and reveal a little bit more of the height of the image as well. So I can go back to the example we were just looking at. And first of all, I should turn off my style sheet and show you that this is just a simple unordered list. There's nothing complex about it. In fact, if I view the source and bump the text size up a little bit, you can see the source in there as well. There's just a simple unordered list. I've got the whole thing contained in a div called header. And then each list item is just a simple list item element, and inside that is an anchor, link anchor tag element. This means it's just a simple text-based technique. You can put any text in there you want. A matter of changing text. You can change text dynamically on the server side, whatever it is. It's really easy to do something like this. And as you can see, it also scales up and down very easily as well. Now, if you were here in the last presentation, you heard a lot about floats. And each one of these is floated. So eventually, you're going to get to the edge of the browser window. And Safari can't go up any higher than that. But you can imagine if I drag my browser window narrower, grab, they're eventually going to wrap. So there are some limitations, but I think I went up about 400 or 500% there before I had any wrapping once in a while. So there are some considerations to use before you do something like this and use floats for navigation like this, but works well in a lot of different scenarios. And that is how sliding doors works. Now, you can also turn sliding doors on its side to create rounded corner boxes, especially if you know the width, if you're confining the width of your content, if you're using a fixed width design. That's what we did for Blogger. We basically just created a top image and a bottom image, and we let them expand apart vertically, just to allow the size of the box to change as the text gets resized. And I actually have a demonstration of that here. Again, I'm just taking an image across the top that has to the top left and right rounded corners, and an image across the bottom. As I scale my text up, that just resizes instantly. And there's no worries about text moving beyond that or having to create multiple boxes or the text sitting outside the box somehow. But we can do the same thing with, if we wanted borders on there, we can actually set up our sliding doors to encompass that as well. These are how the Blogger modules work. These are generic modules that Blogger can insert anywhere they want. We wanted these to be as generic as possible so that we weren't depending on certain elements to appear within these modules. For example, we could have done this with less markup had we declared that each module always has to contain an H2. It always has to start with an H2 and always has to end with, say, a paragraph element that has a class of end or something like that. But we didn't want to constrain the Blogger team for what they wanted to put in these modules. So there are actually 3 divs that kind of contain each module. Those are classed mod, mod 2, and mod 3. And so, if we take a look at this, the bottom set of rounded corners is created with the outside module. You can see the background image that's aligned to the left and the bottom. The second one contains the top set of rounded corners, and the middle one contains the borders that connect everything, or in this case, the shadow, the drop shadow to the right-hand side. And I think there were some very subtle little borders that can appear in there. This is also used on adaptive path, and it can be used in very subtle ways as well. You don't have to think of this as a tab-based metaphor, but if I open up a version of adaptive path, see in the header up there, there is the title, the value of user of experience, and there are kind of these little bitmap shapes on the right that kind of echo part of their logo. Well, that image on the left is anchored, and those images on the right are just kind of sliding out with the browser. So it's the same concept. There's no text in the middle. There's just this big image. But it's the same concept of having an image to the left and an image to the right, and they just kind of overlap and slide apart and across as they need to. Moving on to white space. And I'm going to try to stop a little bit early toward the end, so if you have any questions, try to save them for the end, or if you want to think of some questions while I'm going along, feel free, because I'd like to take some toward the end. But anyways, white space. This is something that we, I think, quickly forget when we move to CSS layout. But we have such easy control over it with margins and padding. Again, I'm going to pick on the New York Times just because they're easy to pick on. They're a large site. And they do things, I think, from a design perspective, very poorly. But they currently are using a table for all of their markup. And if I use a favlet to show you all of the tables on the page, these are the outlines of all the tables. The different colors represent different nested levels of tables. If they wanted to go in and change the white space on their page, the gutters between columns, the white space in between horizontal elements, whatever, they have to go into that table markup and somehow either adjust the spacer gifts, the width of the spacer gifts, probably in some of those cells, or the width they actually apply to each table cell. And that might not be a big deal for one page, but if they've got 50,000 pages on their site, even doing a global search and replace isn't going to fix this exactly. Whereas if they were using CSS, they could just go in and apply a certain margin, a certain number of padding to a certain table column, or not a certain column, and apply that effect immediately to thousands of pages. Just want to compare them to some local guys right here. Jim Ramsey was responsible for the San Francisco Examiner redesign about a year and a half ago. Even down to the approachability of that left-hand navigation. The Examiner was done all with CSS, the CSS layout, no tables used for layout anywhere. And Jim could go in and adjust certain values. He could change the spacing between certain things. He could adjust the line height very easily because it was all contained within a certain container that had an ID on it. But just even comparing those navigation columns, it's very easy to create a much more approachable. You can iterate very quickly and kind of add space, take away space as you see fit. Specifically with kind of a related issue to the white space is this over-reliance on the box model. By default, CSS consists of, or CSS layout consists of a bunch of boxes on the page. It's how CSS is kind of written. It's how CSS is constructed. It's a bunch of boxes on the page. But we're kind of too frequently using those boxes and then kind of relying on, well, I can put a border around this box or I can put a background color behind this. And as a result, CSS-based designs start to look very blocky. It's just kind of a gravitational pull to just start outlining things or putting a background behind things, and all of a sudden you end up with kind of these boxy designs everywhere. There are some designers that are pushing away from that, but I think it's back to that idea of start with your design, design in a different tool first. Don't start designing in CSS if you can avoid it. It's fine to prototype in CSS if you want to do some really rapid kind of user prototypes or models. But it's the same thing of you're designing in CSS, you just kind of naturally add in the properties that make sense, and before you know it, you've got boxes everywhere. One of my suggestions is to use the idea of implied boxes. You don't have to draw a border around all sides of the box. With Blogger, we were just using these really kind of faded gradient headers, and then let the shape of the text and the content of that module define its shape without drawing any borders around it. Same for the login boxes across the top. We were just implying shapes. And sometimes you don't even have to use that. Just let the text imply its own boxes, its own shapes, and then really start to break out of the grid that you set up for your site. Offset something, let it lay over top of a column, and kind of push the text around it. So try to break out of this idea that everything has to be really boxy. And one of the ways to do that is to not start with CSS as a design tool. Line height is something else that many of us have forgotten when we jump into CSS. We didn't really have this ability in HTML, so a lot of people have kind of ignored the fact that line height is settable and that line height has a big impact on readability and usability. This is Blogger at the default line height, no line height set on the page at all. And default line height in most browsers is around 1.2 em. around 1.2 times the total height of the typeface or the font. Just a simple change to like 1.5 em has a major impact on the legibility and the readability of the page. In fact, if you're getting any complaints from users that your type is too small, it might not actually be because your type is too small. It might be because you forgot to address line height. Expand line height by a little bit, and it can make huge differences in the legibility of your type, even if the type is really small. In fact, we did the same thing for Wired News. We had some text in the left-hand column on top of a black background. It was gray, and we adjusted not only the brightness of it, we increased the lighting a little bit, and suddenly the complaints about the small type size stopped immediately. This is a site by a designer named Cameron Mole, English 360. I think he did a really nice job with the site. It's got nice white space, nice typography in certain places, you know, an emotional attachment to the image. There's one place in this page where I think he just completely forgot about something. Can you see where it is? Can you see where I'm going to point to? It's this area right here. He forgot to address line height here, and I think this text is just, it's too sandwiched together. And as a outcome of that, I think it looks a little bit too small, especially back in its default state. But if he had just addressed that and just adjusted a slight bit amount, true, it changes the height of that element on the page, but you can achieve, I think, really nice results if you just open up the line height a little bit on the page. Doesn't need to be much. Don't go overboard with it, or else you end up with it looking like a double-spaced high school report. But a little bit of line height can go a long way. Remote rollovers. This is something that I haven't really ever written about. I've only spoken about it a couple of times, and it's something that I've used on quite a few different locations. It's a pretty cool technique. The easiest way to see that is in some photo galleries that I designed about a year ago. And this is the title page for the gallery. If we go into the gallery page itself and then maybe click on, I don't know, one of these pages. This is the individual photo page. I wanted to represent navigation, being able to go forward or back, so I put a little slide representing the thumbnail of the next image and a slide representing the previous image to the left and to the right. But I didn't want to just rely on that being the only thing to navigate. So you can navigate over each one of these small thumbnail images. Same thing with previous. Or you can also navigate by clicking on the whole right side portion of the photo or the whole left side portion of the photo to go back. Both of these, whether you're mousing over the image thumbnail or the large image, has a little tiny indication that you're going to the next photo. Mainly because I wanted people to be able to realize if they're mousing over the individual photo itself that you can just go forward just by clicking on the right side of the photo. It's a much larger target, and just wanted to give some indication of that. The link that's doing this is actually just one link. There are two components of this link. One of them is being absolutely positioned over the photo itself. But I'll explain how that works in a minute. But that is probably the easiest way to see like this complete remote rollover thing. Like rolling over one thing is changing something else on the page. And it's all done with one link. This was actually created for the Adaptive Path website. The Adaptive Path website unfortunately no longer has this little module on it. It was specifically invented for these little partner photos right here. Adaptive Path is now much more than just 6 partners. But back in the day when they were just 6 partners, they wanted their partner photos on the page. They wanted their names on the page. So I'd come up with one day what I thought was this really cool way of doing it. Saved a lot of space on the page. This is blown up about 200% just so you can see it a little bit better. But I came in and I showed it to Jeff and Peter and Lane, and I said, here, check this out. This is really cool. This is all done with CSS. You can mouse over each photo, and it turns into color, and as you do that, the names appear below. And I just think it's really cool. It's going to save a lot of space. You don't have to have the names there appear all the time. And they said, well, great, but we kind of want our names to appear there all the time. We don't want you to hide our names. Like if the user's not mousing over any of those, we want our names to appear, and we want people to know who we are. So I had to go back to the drawing board on this, and I thought I had kind of the start of something that might work. So instead of hiding the names, I came up with this technique, which actually shows the names all the time. But the same kind of thing can happen where if you mouse over one of the photos, the name changes color and the little bullet beside it changes. Or if you mouse over any of the names, same thing happens. So there's this visual association of one thing relates to something else on the page. It doesn't have to be immediately below it, immediately beside it. It can be anywhere on the page. So this is the genesis of this technique. And again, I can show you, if I turn off my CSS and just let you see the browser's default CSS, this is just a simple unordered list. If I view the source, pump that up a couple of times, you can see that each list item has an ID of it, so that I can address each one specifically and give each one a unique picture that relates to that person. So how do those work? To explain how those work, I'm actually going to back up a second and explain CSS rollovers. And if any of you haven't ever done any CSS rollovers, you could do the same thing in JavaScript. I'm not super familiar with JavaScript. Sometimes it might be better to do certain things in JavaScript because it controls behavior really well. But there are cases where you can just implement a very simple CSS rollover with actually no time at all and no need to get into any JavaScript. And I call this the single image theory. Because remember in the days where you had to create kind of both states of a rollover, kind of had to create the normal state and the hover state as well. And every now and then you had to pre-cache the second image just so that there wouldn't be any delay by the time the user mouses over the image. You have to wait for the other image to load, so you pre-cache the second image. Well, here we're actually just taking one image with both states in it. And we can find the area that shows up just by limiting the height and width of the element that we're assigning this background image to. So that extra portion of the image is still there, it's just not visible until the user mouses over it. And then we just shift that second portion of the image into view with background position, with a negative background position. Say this thing is 160 pixels wide total. We just use a background position of negative 160 pixels to the left. So for remote rollovers, sort of a similar concept is being used here, but we're actually getting into some absolute positioning. How does it work? This is a very simple isolated view of the code. This is just one partner for adaptive path, and I've actually taken out the ID just to make the code even shorter so you can see what's going on here. If we start to review what each of these elements are being used for, the UL defines the positioning context. And by that I mean that the UL is given a position of relative, and it is redefining the positioning context for any elements within that UL. So if I use absolute positioning and I say top 0, left 0, it's no longer the top left portion of the canvas or the browser or the screen. It is now the top left portion of this box. So by defining a positioning context on the UL, everything that I position now is going to be contextual to this box. So that allows me to position something, even if this box is moving around on the page, I can still position something absolutely, and they will move around with the box on the page. Moving forward to the LI. The LI is what sets the whole block that the picture is initially going to be in. It sets that into place. So you can see that the text is showing up there. It's sticking outside the box right now. Lane Becker's name is there. But the box is set up into position. And they're floated left, so each one is going to be floating beside each other. Each successive LI is going to be floating beside the next. Then we move into the link anchor. And this is what's actually displaying the background image. I'm putting the background image on the anchor so that I can change that later on via hover. The M element is actually what I use to pull the text out via absolute positioning. So remember I said that you can position something in context with the box itself and completely pull that outside of the normal box that the link anchor set up. Both of those will remain hot, as in you can click on either one of those. They both follow the same href of the link anchor. But because they're both, one is the link anchor itself and the M is contained within the anchor, now we can manipulate both of those on hover state independently. Because we can write one rule that affects the link anchor on hover. We can affect another rule that says a hover space M, and then affect the M on hover separately. And again, I'll take some more questions after we kind of finish up here. Just want to make sure I cover through everything. This can also be used for remote linking. They don't necessarily always have to be rollovers. They don't have to achieve complex effects. In fact, sometimes people might not even know that you're doing this. It doesn't have to create an association. This is an example on Stop Design. I just happened to shorten up my philosophy page just so you could see this in effect. My hosting partner is Media Temple. And they wanted a link in the top right-hand corner of the page, and they also wanted a link in my footer. I didn't want to put two links on the page that pointed to the same place. Just didn't think they were worth that, no. It was more a case of I just didn't want to have redundant information that was going to link to the exact same place. So what I did is there's a little, if I zoom in down here, you can see the link down here. You hover over that, it changes color a little bit. You get the tooltip that actually says what they are. Same thing on the top of the page. If I mouse over that, changes color slightly, you get the exact same tooltip. But if you notice, when I mouse over the thing on the top, if you can see what's happening down in the footer, it's highlighting the same link. Same thing down here. If I mouse over this, you can see it turns on the hover up on the top. Now, most of the time, no one will ever see this because my pages are usually longer than the typical screen is. Unless you have a really big screen, you'll never even see this. So it's kind of just my own personal little Easter egg type thing. But how this is working, if I view the source, bump it up, scroll all the way down to the footer. Up just a little bit. See this little trademark entity right there? That's how I'm doing it. In the view itself, you're not actually seeing a trademark beside their name down in the footer. So I'm actually just taking that trademark and repositioning up to the top of the page using absolute positioning, top 0, right 0, or whatever the value it is that needs to be pushed down a little bit from the top right-hand corner. And so I get basically the same effect. Same link in two different elements that operate independently of each other, can be styled independently of each other, but they're created with the same link. One more potential use of remote rollovers, and I'm not advocating that Google Maps does this at all, because they're doing everything in JavaScript anyways, but just to show and highlight the power of this. One of the things I've never liked about Google Maps is that you actually have to click on some of those little push pins to get the related information, or you have to click on them to see what they relate to on the map itself. But this is all done with CSS. If we did remote rollovers, we just highlight on one of these things, hover them without even clicking anything. Same thing over here. Both sets of these, the push pin and the information on the right and the push pin on the map, are created with the exact same link. There's just some extra there's another nested element somewhere within the information on the right-hand side, and I know the plotted points on the left, and I can reposition an extra element with a push pin in the background. I can position that right over the map so that both of them are created with the same link. Take that a step further, and you could actually incorporate the little bubbles that Google Maps uses as well. And then the same thing over here, just mousing over these. There's just a little bit of extra feedback that just helps the user kind of just get the picture immediately without having to click on something and realize, oh, okay, this is that thing over there. They're just kind of mousing over each individual thing. And again, this might not be the right usability move for them. I just wanted to show how easy it is to do something like this, how possible it is, what it could be used for. Better bullets. What do you guys use to create bullets right now? List style image? You heard of that property? Anyone use list style image? Oh, come on, a couple of you do. Who uses background images? Okay, good. Maybe some of you have seen this presentation before. Or maybe just figured out that if you use list style image in one browser and then go to another browser, that bullet can be in a completely different space. And this frustrated me to no end when I first started working with CSS. So what I basically simply recommend is using background image instead. Turn off the list style images altogether. Don't use the default, or don't even try to use the default list style image for position. Use background image. You have much more control over its position. And then when you change to a different browser, they'll be in the exact same position, or roughly, pretty much a lot closer than what list style image is. Once you start using background images for list bullets, you can start doing really interesting things, especially if you plan ahead and think about overlaps and how things kind of scale, and if you allow some extra image information in there so that when people resize their text, those things still connect. All kinds of interesting things you can do, and there's a URL down at the bottom. If you look at this presentation later, you can actually check out this example and resize the text yourself. This is how we do some bullets on Blogger. Again, each one of these list items is ID'd so that we can attach a unique image to it. With CSS3, we won't have to do that anymore. We can use some advanced selectors to determine the order, and we can just say the first list item in this list gets the one image, and the second item gets the two image. We won't have to ID or class those at all. But until that day, we have to ID or class each one of those so we know which bullet to attach. This is a site by Jake Tracy. He just uses some very simple page icons for list bullets instead of the default. Flex your text. This is something I mentioned to a few people I was going to talk about in this presentation. This is something that I'm betting most of you aren't doing enough or aren't planning for, and it's something that can really be kind of a gotcha. If you suddenly see your site on someone else's computer and someone else's browser, and all of a sudden you're like, wait, what's going on there? What'd you do? Text by default in almost every browser can be resized. If you size text in pixels, Internet Explorer cannot currently resize that text, but any other browser can resize text in pixels, and any other unit that you assign to text, any browser can resize that text. Now, this means it is very easy potentially, or is it very potentially easy to assign fixed widths to things. But get out of the idea that you can have a fixed height of anything. If it has text in it that can be resized, that thing is not locked in at a certain height. Your header is not guaranteed to be 100 pixels tall. Don't get into the trap of thinking that your header is 100 pixels tall. If you only design a background image that it is 100 pixels tall, and you don't add any extra background color that kind of matches that background image, if someone resizes the text on your site, you might end up with something like this. Don't get caught in this trap. It's very easy. You start thinking a little bit more flexibly. Resize that text in your browser every now and then. Just double check, like, oh, did I build that right? Did I count for text resizing like that? Am I letting text overlap? That's another big problem once you get into, especially with absolute positioning, or even floats sometimes. All of a sudden your text is going to start overlapping once people bumps it up. Now, you shouldn't have to worry about like 1,000% increases in text size. But people should be able to bump up their text 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 times. And your design shouldn't break that horribly. It might not look the best ever, but if you account for that, maybe not make as many columns on the page, make sure that your header expands any background images behind other headings on the page. Just account for it. It's not the prettiest, but at least you're not having a completely broken looking site. People can still read all the text on the page. And you're taking into account text resizing, or later on, just adding additional text to anything. So back to Cameron Moll's example for English 360. This is one of the things that I do when I get either sent sites for review, or when I encounter something that looks really good, I want to see how well it's built. Not only will I toggle off their CSS so I can see the browser's default, but I also start bumping up text size to see, did they think about this at all? There's 2 bumps up in text size. Starting to become completely illegible because he's fixed everything into place. Now, this is partly an inherent trait of the design. The design kind of doesn't really allow for that much expansion unless he had a lot of extra image with the woman on the phone, and he could kind of allow that thing to expand and reveal more and more of the image, kind of like a sliding doors pseudo concept there. The way to deal with this is, which we can use the example that we walked through in the previous presentation. And I didn't actually get to this version, so it's kind of a good chance for me to talk about it anyways. This is the elastic version that we created in the last presentation of Trinaka.com. And what do I mean by elastic? Well, there are several different approaches to web design, several different theories of what's better and what's not. There are fixed width designs out there, which are fixed to a specific pixel width, and they will not change no matter how you resize your text, no matter how you resize your browser, they will stay at a fixed width. And in fact, if I open up another browser window, pull up the original version of this. If I bump up the text size a couple sizes, the only jumps you saw there was the scroll bar appearing on the right-hand side, but basically the design stays the exact same width. This is a fixed width design. Liquid width designs, such as, for example, Wired News, that's a bad example. But liquid width designs will flex with the browser. Let's not quit Safari. Thank you. Meaning that your columns are constantly changing in width, or at least your entire design is flexing with the width. There's a third approach that has come out in the last year or so that's called either elastic, or sometimes it's called Jello. I can't even keep up with all the names they're using for them. But this one is one that has kind of a rough size applied to it here. But if you start resizing the text, let's go back to the elastic version. If you start resizing the text, the entire design starts flexing as well to allow for roughly the same proportion of line length. So we can go down, we can go up. And this is kind of a rejiggered approach that we had in the last presentation. This is using percentages everywhere instead of pixels for the column widths. And the only thing really different about it is that instead of specifying a width or just a single width to the outer page div, we've assigned a maximum width of whatever is like 50em or 60em, so that that width then scales as the text size goes up or down. Now, one of the things, the reason I want to get back to this is talking about this image in the header. So say that's the default width that you think your image is going to be. If you're allowing for a liquid width design or this elastic version of the design, you have to account for the fact that your image might not always be 730 pixels or however wide it is here. If someone blows up the text, that image has to get wider. Or at least you have to have some background color kind of naturally flowing into that image, like fade out that image into this blue that I have over there, and that's what I did in this case. I just had to make sure I had enough of the image to the right-hand side and was able to kind of blend that into a solid background color. So no matter how wide this window gets, that color will always kind of blend in and will never look like I stopped the image too short. Same thing, if this were actually text, real HTML text in here, this is part of the image right here, this return to simplicity. But if that were HTML text and I had that sitting on top of the image, that means that most likely that header or that image header could expand. So I need to account for some extra height in that image as well. So I'd make sure that I wouldn't actually get rid of or crop out that image, but I'd actually use like a larger height image and allow that to reveal a little bit more of that as the browser resized any of the text.
Can you manually resize that browser?
Yes. So if I go all the way up, so this is basically full width. Grab the corner. Yeah, so the entire design is changing width, and it's also changing width with text size as well. So that roughly you're getting roughly the same proportion of amount of text that fits per line as it scales up. And you can imagine if you had a much larger monitor, you could really zoom up the text, quite large, and the design would mostly be intact, as opposed to this version of the page, where once you start zooming up your text, you really start to lose some of that quality of like not only a couple of words fit per line in some of that headline. So it's just a way of dealing with that on a little different scale. And I really wanted to address the image and allowing enough for that image so that more of it is revealed, and so it doesn't look like you kind of prematurely just determined a too short of an image width. So let's see. With that, we've got about 10 minutes. I just want to close off with a quote here, and that beauty in design is not only what we see, it's also what we can't see. So remember that when you're designing these pages in CSS. And with that, I'll wrap it up, and we'll have time for some questions. Any questions out there?
The adjustment that you had when you were doing manual adjustment, that was only adjusting the width.
That was only adjusting the width. I'll try to repeat these questions so that everyone can hear them.
To make it adjust the height as well, is that a completely different problem?
Well, so he's asking about adjusting the height as well. And I'm actually trying not to set the height at all. In fact, you kind of have to get out of the mode of even trying to set height, because height is basically an implicit height that's determined by how much content you put on the page. And how tall or how big the text size is on the page. So if I resize this page, the height just gets bigger as the content itself gets bigger. I haven't defined any explicit heights except for the image-based header, because I knew that that's not going to change. Who else? Right here.
How do you, or when you're doing a design like this, how would you determine or go about determining if you want it to be a fixed size or a liquid size or a elastic size?
When you're going about a design like this, how do you determine whether you, and I'll put the URL back up here so you can see it. How do you go about determining whether something should be liquid width, fixed width, elastic? That's a matter of, sometimes it's a matter of personal preference. Also, it's a matter of what type of content you have on the page. Sites that are very heavy in text-based content work well with liquid width designs because they kind of flex with the browser. People can open up their browsers a little bit wider if they have more real estate. But also be aware of line length there. You don't want to create columns that are like infinitely long. People have to read all the way across the screen and then go back to the beginning and read all the way across the screen again. You can set max width for browsers other than IE to control that. Unfortunately, IE doesn't support the max width property. Fixed width designs work well when you're inserting a bunch of images and you know the width of those images. Say, for example, a news site that always has like a certain width of an image for their main news item. But it is constrictive, and something, if you decide a fixed width of, say, 750 pixels wide to fit on an 800 pixel screen, and then someone comes along viewing it with a 30-inch cinema display that has like 2,400 pixels of real estate, your site is going to be like super narrow down the middle. There are some methods coming out to using JavaScript to detect screen real estate and automatically adjusting the fixed width interface to a wider pixel value if they detect a higher res display. Cameron Adams on themaninblue.com talked about some of that. He's an Australian in Melbourne. Elastic designs are just really kind of starting to come out. So elastic designs are kind of the best of both worlds. You get a little bit of fluidness, a little bit of liquidity, but yet you kind of can roughly predict the line length, at least in terms of number of characters per line. So that's why elastic designs are just starting to become popular, because people are realizing, like, oh, this is really nice. Now, a word about that, it won't work the same way in IE. Since IE does not support the max width property, the content or the design in IE will just fill all the available space and it'll look just like a liquid width page. Once IE7 comes out, hopefully they will be supporting the max width property, and your design will work correctly. But just know that in all other browsers except IE, it will scale nicely as the text goes up and scale down as the text size comes down. But in IE, it'll just fill the entire width of the browser just like a liquid width design would. All right, over here.
What would you recommend how you declare font size? And I noticed that you did something like small, and then you, in other areas, you set the 85%. That's kind of
Good. How do I go about specifying font size? And sometimes you saw small, and sometimes you saw percentages. And this is a question that came up twice after the last presentation. And I tend to like using keywords on the body element, like style the body element with a keyword. And when I say keywords, I mean small, medium, large, extra large. There are keyword values with CSS, and most of the browsers are fairly good at determining what size to display small at or what size to display medium at, except for IE5 and except for IE6 if you don't use a doc type that forces it into strict mode. There are means of overcoming that by applying a filter, and you'll see if you download any of the files from the Trinaka.com site, you'll see some filters in there and some style sheets set up specifically for IE5 and IE6. That give them different values. IE5 specifically, not IE6, because you can force IE6 into strict mode and it behaves just like Firefox. So I tend to set the keyword once on the body with, tend to set font size once on the body with keywords, and then everywhere else I use percentages. And those percentages all are relative to that initial keyword on the body. And the reason I do that is because if I ever decide to say, for example, on Stop Design, I can actually show you this. Stop Design sets its font size with small on the body element. But I have this preferences page where people can go in and not only change the design a little bit, but they can change the original keyword to medium or say large. Save that. And now all the text everywhere on the site is larger. But the only thing I had to do was apply that different keyword to the body element, because all the font sizes everywhere else are set in percentages, and they're all relative to that one keyword on the body. So if you do that, then it's much easier to just change font sizes globally or automatically increase them and let someone just save their preferences without having to bump the text size up in their browser every time they come to a new page. That's just one way I do it. A lot of people do it differently. Some people swear by M's and percentages. I think Owen Briggs, there's a site called the Noodle Incident. If you search for the Noodle Incident, you'll find his page where he did a study of all the different means of applying consistent font size via CSS. And you'll see he went through 20 or 30 different methods, and he came up with one that he recommends. You could go with that approach, or you could go with my approach. Study any of these pages, either Trinaka or Stop Design, but I tend to prefer just using a keyword on the body and then percentages everywhere else. It's just easier for me to worry about. Maybe in the back somewhere, back there. Mm-hmm. So when I'm dealing with relative and absolute position elements to redefine positioning concepts, do I have problems in IE5 or IE6? I haven't seen anything that's caused problems. Everything I showed you with the adaptive path partner photos works in IE5 and IE6 as well. Same thing in with all the remote rollover stuff, like with the photo galleries. The only thing you'll notice, for example, with the photo galleries is that I had to use a different type of image. For all more standard compliant browsers that support pings, I'm using transparent pings to kind of overlay those little previous and next photos. With Internet Explorer, since they don't support transparent pings, I had to use kind of a dotted GIF that kind of has half transparency and half not transparency. But as far as I know, all of that redefining the positioning context, like setting something up as relative and then positioning things absolutely within that, works everywhere. That's been supported since IE5. There's someone closer down in front, right there.
Yeah, do you prefer to use
How do I set up my style sheets? Do I use multiple style sheets, single style sheet?
That is related to that. How do you handle this design, new GL design, print CSS?
So certainly anything that uses a different media type is usually a different style sheet. Although sometimes I tend to combine screen, projection, and I forget what the third media type I sometimes tend to combine, but certainly print is usually always a completely different media type, only because I turn off almost all my background images. I turn the text mostly to black. I use point values for font size instead of keywords and percentages because point is relative to print. Point is not necessarily a good unit to use for screen because it varies across different platforms. As far as breaking up the style sheet, or like kind of some of the main style sheets, I tend to link to kind of a master style sheet, and then I might break down the properties or the rules into a few different style sheets, especially if I know that I'm going to be editing those in blocks at times. So for example, on stop design, I can maybe even show you really quickly, if I can bring it up fast enough. CSS and base. Now let's go master. So in stop design right now, I really haven't broken it up much. I've broken it up into base and forms. So base is where basically everything is, and then color I can apply selectively as well. So if I know that I'm only going to be working on color values for a certain site, say for example Wired News had a whole set of color style sheets that could be imported separately than all the base information. So I'll break those out into a separate style sheet. In theory, you could break these out into as many as you wanted, but that means a separate server call, especially for the first time the user hits that page. For each one of those, it's kind of a separate request. But in theory, style sheets are cached, so that wouldn't make a difference after the first visit to the site. I just find it's a personal preference, however you like to work. If you like to work in smaller chunked files, or if you like to work in one big file and just do a search on that one file to find what you're looking for. Sometimes that's easier for people, especially when you're starting out, or when you're just starting out on a site. It's much easier to keep everything in one file. That way you can kind of scroll up and down, you can search for it, find it. I tend to use these things called flags in my style sheet, so you can see that I use lines and comments to break apart my style sheet. And so I can just search for something like that and jump straight to that section. Or you could break up into multiple style sheets. It's more of a personal preference, I think. All right. Thank you, everyone.